Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Power to the Flower podcast. If you're new here, my name is Nairobi and I'm the host. On this podcast, we talk about cannabis policy and its effects to Black and Brown communities, particularly how some of these laws, when enforced, can cause negative and disproportionate impacts to our communities. On this inaugural episode, we're going to be discussing cannabis, gun laws, and the U.S. Supreme Court, and how in a landmark case, we may actually see who may or may not be able to own a gun, and whether or not cannabis users will be considered unlawful users and ineligible of owning or possessing a firearm. This case could actually challenge the Second Amendment and the Gun Control Act of 1968. U.S. versus Hemani is a case that is presented by the United States Justice Department versus Ali Hemani and his lawyers, represented by the ACLU. The biggest stakes are for Black and Brown communities, those who are immigrants, and those who are duly U.S. citizens, just like Ali Hemani. This case is forcing the U.S. Supreme Court to answer a very serious question. That question being, can the U.S. federal government treat all cannabis users as so dangerous that they lose access to their Second Amendment constitutional right, which is the right to bear arms? And if so, how does that conflate with those states that have legalized cannabis for all residents over a specific age? If the U.S. Supreme Court is able to answer this question, there are two possible scenarios. One that goes in favor on behalf of the United States Department of Justice, and the other that might go in favor of Al Hamani and those who are just like him. Either way, on this episode, we're going to walk through what the law says, what the justices are thinking, and how those impacts are going to affect our communities that are Black and Brown and those who have been already criminalized for not only their drug use, but also for the possession of a firearm. So, why don't we start with the statute itself? The federal law of the Gun Control Act of 1968 states that anyone who is an unlawful user of a controlled substance or is addicted to any one of these substances is not able to or cannot possess a firearm or any ammunition. The main problem here, though, is Congress never actually really defined what an unlawful user actually means. And because there's such a gray area in this definition, we don't know whether or not Al Hamani is actually an unlawful user, or even if someone like myself who lives in the state of Massachusetts where cannabis is legal would be defined as an unlawful user despite the federal illegalities of marijuana. The combination of owning both a firearm and actually consuming cannabis could actually land you a felony charge. And the reason is because if the government who treats cannabis as a federal contraband can prove that you are an unlawful user who is frequently using it or is addicted to it, then they actually might be able to arrest you. But this case is actually trying to prove who is actually able to receive a felony charge, even if you were able to purchase a gun legally in your state, purchase cannabis legally in your state, whether or not you were high while handling the gun, or even if you were using it in acts of violence. Some states have that you can open carries, others do not. But depending on the combination, you may land yourself with a federal felony. So we are looking and following this case closely because the ramifications are steep for many, many individuals. Once you have a felony, you're not able to apply for certain housing, right? Federal housing. If you have a felony, you might not be able to receive certain benefits if you are a U.S. citizen or not. So the ramifications, like I said before, or even the impacts to certain individuals are steeper than we could imagine. Well, this is exactly what's in front of the Supreme Court right now. They're having to determine, based on what the historical gun laws have been used and what this case is brought before them at this current moment in time. What the U.S. Justice Department is actually trying to do is to analogize or basically include marijuana users as the intoxicated groups, like those who drink alcohol and are wildly intoxicated, and they're trying to group marijuana users like that as well. The Supreme Court justices are going to have to determine whether or not cannabis users are too dangerous to be able to possess a firearm. Some of the reactions of the Supreme Court justices were really interesting because someone like Justice Neil Gorsuch was looking at the case side-eyed when he referenced Sam Adams as being one of those people who were intoxicated. I mean, there's a whole beer line named after him, but he asked the question, was he someone that was deemed too dangerous to possess a firearm? And he was one of the founding fathers, right? So this is kind of like what the Supreme Court is actually having to interpret, and they're looking at the historical references in order to determine their decision. To understand the stakes of this case, we actually have to look at cannabis laws and its enforcement, how it works, and who gets hit on the ground. It is said that Black and white people use cannabis relatively in the same frequency, meaning there's not much difference in who uses it more in racial groups. When it comes to the enforcement and who gets criminalized for the possession of marijuana, Black people are 3.6 times more likely nationwide to get arrested for possession. And in some states, it's even higher. It could be from 6 to 10 times more likely for Black people to be arrested for possession for the use of cannabis versus white people in the United States. And brown folks who are usually criminalized at the same rate, you'll see that those statistics are very similar as well for them too. It's to no surprise that in both gun enforcement and in marijuana enforcement, Black people are particularly targeted the most as opposed to their racial counterparts like white folks and even brown folks. So this will undoubtedly have repercussions to the Black communities in the United States of America. In the nation's capital, for instance, Black people make up 45% of the total DC population. However, when it comes to those who were arrested for possession of marijuana, 89% of those individuals were Black. Is that any surprise to you? No. And given the recent policing of DC from behalf of the government, the federal government, looking to over police there, that is one of the things that they were looking to police for, especially as you can see, the federal government is arguing in favor for this case. So there is a true concern for our Black populations throughout the United States. So when we talk about marijuana users, quote unquote, in abstract, it sounds very race neutral, but it's actually not. The data shows us something else completely. So when we're looking at those who will be particularly criminalized if this does actually go through, we know that Black people will be the most vulnerable. And the problem is that the solutions won't just be met with a simple individual case-by-case basis. This will be a sweeping change that will target Black and brown communities. Couple that with the gun charges, these stats don't just go away. If anything, with the Supreme Court decision like this, it will be furthermore perpetuated in favor of the government enforcement rather than in favor of Black and brown individuals. These consequences are long-lasting, and they can even go as far as these consequences are long-lasting, and they have impacts to people's criminal debt in the court system. It has impacts to people's housing opportunities and even their job opportunities. So this doesn't just extend to one situation where it can get forgiven after, time served, but this has longer lasting implications for generations to come. If we're serious about cannabis reform, if we're serious about gun control reform, these are one of the things that we need to be paying attention to. This case in particular, the U.S. versus Hemani case, is a landmark case for so many different reasons, but this being the main one. The system already treats Black and brown cannabis users as the singular most arrested individuals for the use of cannabis. And these implications, these racial biases, don't go away either. The racial biases that we see will extend as far as people's court debt, what they're having to pay, as well as what opportunities they might have for housing and employment as their lives move forward, because it's not just where it ends at the jail system, but it goes as far as after when folks are trying to re-enter society. So there's a lot for us to think about if this case does pass. Any policy that says if you're a drug user, you can't hold a gun doesn't just stop there. It leads into a whole vacuum of issues, which is that Black people will be more likely to be searched for guns as well as for cannabis use. There's going to be multiple things that happen, like just random stop arrests, which already happens anyway. Police will also be looking for routine drug use as well as surveillance to these communities to ensure that these laws are being followed. And if not, according to their discretion, they may or may not use this as another reason to criminalize Black and Brown people. That is why we need to advocate as Black and Brown folks who do consume cannabis. It also gives prosecutors the ability to put stack on charges, which is another method that prosecutors use just to extend the time for someone who has already been arrested for one charge. If the Supreme Court upholds the law and allows for this vagueness to continue in its definition of what an unlawful user is, it is clear as day that the people who will be targeted the most will be Black and Brown individuals. If the court goes in favor of Ali Hemani and says that you can't just strip away rights of individuals to own a gun just because of their regular marijuana use, then it eliminates that sense of vagueness and provides an actual statute as to who can and when they can be determining of marijuana use and gun possession against the Gun Control Act of 1968. This also leads for fewer stops and arrests that would be culminating these two charges to lead into a felony charge to Black and Brown communities, further protecting millions of Americans who fit in the category of marijuana users, whether on a daily basis, a monthly basis, or having smoked marijuana before, and those who possess guns, those who legally are in possession of guns. So the real story isn't about whether or not cannabis users can have guns. It's rather who gets policed for using cannabis and for having a gun, and who is actually framed as dangerous for being in possession of a gun. Even if the Supreme Court decides to strike this case, it still doesn't actually fully protect Black and Brown individuals from the statistics we just cited over here. It means that the police can actually use other tools to still use and arrest people for other types of felony charges. And we specifically just need to be able to handle this with much more caution and care, because whatever the U.S. Department of Justice is trying to pursue in means of justice means that those who are likely to be targeted will need to be more susceptible for whatever is coming their way. Let's bring in those who are dual citizens and immigrants into the fore. The reason is because Ali Hemani is a dual citizen. He is of Iranian descent and therefore he carries both Irani and U.S. citizenship through naturalization in the United States, but also through birth through the Iranian citizenship. Immigration law still uses marijuana as one of those reasons to convict and actually bar someone from becoming a naturalized citizen based on good moral character. Now, for those who are in possession of a firearm or carry even marijuana on them and have marijuana possession charges, can actually be barred from entering the US or even continuing on with their dual citizenship. It means to strip them away from the US citizenship if they are found in violation because it is a actual felony charge. This actually means that not only will those folks who are already immigrants into this country face that barrier of a charge, but also have to face other consequences like others who are U.S. citizens by birth, which is having to face insecure housing opportunities and even limited employment opportunities, which is already difficult enough for those who are immigrants. So I think it's really important for individuals who are looking to consume cannabis and also own a firearm to understand their legal status, not just here in this country, but to understand their legal status and opportunities available to them by their state. So it's important that we follow the law and follow this case closely. So just to wrap up here, we talked about some of the reactions of the Supreme Court justices as well as the impacts to Black and Brown communities. We also talked about what this case means in general for gun owners and those who consume cannabis, but we also talked about those who are in a situation like Ali Hemani with their citizenship status being at stake if this passes in favor of the United States Department of Justice. Some of those stats that were staggering that we saw was that Black people are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested overall in the United States, but in cities like Washington, D.C., overwhelmingly overrepresented in the criminalization by a staggering amount of 89% of arrests of all marijuana possessions in D.C. are Black people. So I leave this with you to not only follow this case, but to also follow along with me while I give you some updates as we hear some of the arguments moving forward. Arguments were heard on March 2nd. When we will hear again from the Supreme Court is in June of 2026. This decision could be detrimental to many people across the United States, if not millions. And those who are looking to exercise their constitutional rights, whether it be the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third, all the way up to the different bills of rights that we have, we just need to be aware that our constitutional rights are at risk at this current moment in time by the way that the Supreme Court is actually looking at this case. Stay tuned for more updates. And again, thank you so much for tuning in. That's a wrap for episode 1 of season 3. Thank you.